Story 1. Back in the day, someone told me to read 50 Shades of Grey, saying it was very good. How this ever got published is beyond me. It has the worst writing I have ever encountered. Story 2. If I don't like a book, I put it down. There isn't really a worst one because I can't speak to how bad those books could have become. Life is too short to consume media that isn't good. Story 3. Without a doubt, it's Rich Dad, Poor Dad. It's obvious that many of the stories are fabricated, and a significant portion of the book promotes a board game created by the author. I have a personal rule to finish a book once I start, so I force myself to read the last half despite my dislike for it. Story 4. I cannot stand Neil Gaiman's writings. I have at least 3 of his books, and all of them are in my unfinished pile. Story 5. I ended up reading one of the Colleen Hoover romance novels that many women are obsessed with, thinking it might be a fun, easy read. It was so bad. I am genuinely curious how adult women can enjoy that content. Story 6. The Bible. This is not an attack on the faith or anything, but I was required to read it extensively as a child, and I must say it is not a page-turner. It is not exactly easy reading either. Story 7. Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand is a 700-page exploration of libertarian themes, featuring characters who deliver lengthy speeches while the plot unfolds slowly. Story 8. I know this is an easy point to make, but it's true, 50 Shades. Regardless of the quality of the content, it is terribly repetitive, predictable, and cliched. How many times do you have to emphasize how large someone's hands are? Oh, the shy girl falls in love with the macho, mysterious, rich guy? No way. I couldn't get past half of the book. It is easily the worst thing I have ever read. Story 9. House of Darkness, House of Light by Andrea Perron. This is the book on which The Conjuring is based. While the family appears nice in interviews and seems genuine despite the involvement of the Warrens, this book is a chore. I understand she was writing this 40 years after the events, but it feels like reading a fever dream rather than a novel about someone's experiences. She uses complex vocabulary in an awkward manner, as though trying to showcase her extensive word knowledge. The book drags on, and if it had been well written, it would have been half the length. It is one of the few books I have ever returned for a refund. Story 10. Ready Player One. It is so cringe. It feels like it was written by a 14-year-old boy who had never properly spoken to a girl, let alone touched one. It's honestly disgusting. I love the movie. It's truly great, but the book is depraved. Story 11. I don't remember the title, but it was a fantasy book, and the protagonist kept yelling Hellfire as his catchphrase. I couldn't finish it. Story 12. Hatchet. I know people loved it in school, but I honestly hated it. Someday I will reread it as an adult to see if the criticism I gave it is warranted. Story 13. I don't know about ever, but I just read Intermezzo by Sally Rooney for a book club, and it was definitely the worst book I've read in a while. Story 14. James Michener's Centennial. I usually love his books, but people didn't appear until several chapters later. Story 15. I received an advanced reader copy of this book. It was one of the worst books I have ever read. Story 16. Breaking Dawn. Just thinking about that book makes me angry. A teenage girl decides not to go to college because she is marrying a wealthy man. Then her best friend falls in love with her child. See, I'm getting angry. Story 17. Wuthering Heights. I always heard about what a classic it was, so I finally read it. That was difficult. I had to force myself to finish it. It was, without a doubt, the most boring piece of literature I've ever read. Story 18. Vellum. The Book of All Hours. Deeply researched and written with confidence, the author presents a work that purports to be profound and meaningful. However, it ultimately falls short, resulting in a dull and confusing narrative. Story 19. The Last Librarian. I have been an avid reader since 5th grade. By the time I read The Last Librarian, I had well over 1,000 books, if not more. In all that time, it was the first book I rated 1 star, and it made me change my rule about not finishing books. The story begins with the last librarian of the last physical library trying to save as many books as possible before a government crew arrives to destroy them. It shifts from that scenario to corporations battling each other for control of the Earth, eventually leading to immortal environmentalist terrorists linked to a Martian artifact fighting against corporations for dominance over the planet. For two-thirds of the book, the focus is on the last librarian, but then he is abruptly killed off-page. You only learn of his death when a minor character informs the librarian's son that his father was killed. There is a lengthy 5- or 6-page info dump at the beginning of the book explaining how the word for email evolved into Zooms, how the term cigarette changed, and so on. To be honest, I could probably write a book about everything wrong with this one. I disliked it that much. Story 20. America 2014. An Orwellian tale is essentially a poor remake of 1984, set during the George Bush administration. The author plays a self-insert love interest for the main character. I received it for free from someone distributing copies for a promotional event at my college's common area in 2006. Took me about a month to read because it was just so disappointing. Story 21. The worst book I have ever read, possibly the worst book by any criteria, is Eat Them Alive by Pierce Nace. Story 22. Back in high school, I read a standalone book titled Boy Toy. It didn't have a synopsis, but the cover caught my interest. The story was about a middle school boy being groomed by his teacher. What made it disturbing was the get-over-it mentality that continuously appeared in the senior year chapters. Came across as strange. Story 23. Shadow Moon by Chris Claremont and George Lucas is a sequel to the 1980s fantasy movie Willow. It is written by one of the most famous X-Men writers, based on an outline by George Lucas. How could it be bad? Remember all the characters you loved from the movie? Well, all of them are dead. They are killed in the first chapter. An apocalypse wipes out the kingdom while Willow is unconscious. Willow, the princess, and the brownies survive. Willow changes his name to Thorn Drumheller for some reason. The princess is now a spoiled, unlikable teenager. There is some nonsense with a fake Willow, a demon, and them finding new allies. It is the first of a 3-part trilogy, but I didn't bother reading the rest, even though I had gotten all 3 in a bargain book bin. I was really glad the Disney Plus show didn't follow the books. Story 24. Harry Potter is a disappointing book. Reading it will waste a significant amount of your valuable time. The storyline is lacking, and the characters are uninteresting. The plot is also poor and predictable. Story 25. The Host. I sort of expected it when my friend gave it to me since it's a Stephenie Meyer book. The premise and lore are rather interesting, though they feel like a ripoff of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. However, it was diminished by the fact that I didn't care about the alien parasite falling in love with one guy while her host body was in love with another. Story 26. The Ill-Made Mute by Dart Thornton is poorly written, breaks its own mythos, has characters acting to further the plot even if they completely behave out of character, and features a twist ending that is predictable from page 10. The Forest of Hands and Teeth is a novel that reads like a poorly written self-insertion fan fiction. The only character to make it to the end is insufferable, while the other characters take turns sacrificing themselves for her in a world that should have fallen apart long ago if you consider any aspects of the world building the author attempts. Story 27. The Virgin Suicides is a one-dimensional story with no tension or plot development. It takes 300 pages to convey that the characters' lives were tragic and they ultimately took their own lives. Story 28. From a Buick 8. This is the only Stephen King book I dislike. There are only a handful of words he's written that I haven't read at this point. Story 29. Extreme Ownership. I had to read it for work. It is primarily composed of stories from the Iraq War, with management lessons added to fit the self-help genre aimed at men in middle management. The lessons are not profound and vary from basic strategies for addressing problems to questionable concepts that are applicable only within a military context, as well as overly simplistic statements about leadership in general. The book should be a pamphlet, but it is difficult to market a pamphlet for $20 and to charge $100,000 per speaking engagement without the extra content. I am just relieved that I did not pay for it. Story 30. I once tried to read a high fantasy book that was so expansive, with so many characters, that it included an index of people, their backgrounds, and their familial relationships. I trudged through the first 2 chapters, and after several pauses to look up characters, I returned it to Goodwill where I found it. It was almost in mint condition. Story 31. The English version of a Chinese novel called A Jewish Piano was a word-for-word literal translation done by a machine. Every sentence was awkward, such as, "I want to go with you," and "Where are you going?" Story 32. Spin the Dawn. The Cruel Prince. I thought I would try experiencing some young adult fantasy written by women. Now I am cautious about spending money on a book until I determine the author's target audience. Story 33. I can't remember what it is called, but it is a popular book about a whale. I never finished it because my mind kept wandering off. Story 34. One of my good friends is an author, so I bought her book to be supportive. I didn't know it was steamy erotica. I could tell a lot of the book was autobiographical, and unfortunately, I couldn't make it through because I kept imagining her as the main character. It was nicely written and wasn't a bad book, but it was definitely uncomfortable to read. I had a hard time looking her in the eye for a while, and we never talked about the book. Story 35. Greatness is Upon You by Eric Thomas. Catcher in the Rye. Of Mice and Men. Decent story, but I mostly do not understand why it was part of my high school's curriculum. The Secret. Think and Grow Rich. There is also a young adult novel about 2 brothers involved in the Revolutionary War. Most of the book took place in court. I believe one of the brothers was on trial. It was a sequel to another book I had never read before yet was required to give an impromptu report on. I did poorly, and my teacher scolded me in the hallway for it. If anyone knows what I am talking about, please let me know. Story 36. The Gathering by and Enright won the Booker Prize, but I found it to be whining drivel. I have not read 40 Shades of Grey because it sounded unappealing. Story 37. Many of these comments refer to books that are assigned in school. When people are forced to read something they do not want to, they are unlikely to enjoy it. Personally, I could not stand The Scarlet Letter. Even reading the summaries was boring. Story 38. The Harry Potter books were disappointing. I realized that at age 7 on the release of the 6th book. I enjoyed them before then because I was younger than 7. Also, The Handmaid's Tale was unsatisfying. Not because of the concept or message, which were excellent, but the book itself did not engage me or progress in a meaningful way. I prefer Margaret Atwood's later works much more. Oh, I almost forgot about the Divergent series. It's telling that I nearly overlooked them, honestly. Story 39. If I dislike a book by the 2nd chapter, I will stop reading it. Unfortunately, that was not possible in school. I am referring to the Odyssey and any works by Ernest Hemingway. Story 40. Taming the Beast and the 2 Adeline books, both labeled as erotic, were simply awful and cringe-inducing. Story 41. Atlas Shrugged. I'm fortunate I didn't read it until I was in my 30s and mature enough to realize how bad it was. I was ready to give up about 150 pages in but felt I had to persevere through this cultural icon. I did skip that chapter. If you've read it, you know the one I mean. It's poorly written, the characters are unlikable, and the ideology is worse. I think some teenage boys feel morally superior because they've waded through this tedious, rambling book. John Rogers put it best. There are 2 novels that can change a bookish 14-year-old's life: The Lord of the Rings and Atlas Shrugged. One is a childish fantasy that often engenders a lifelong obsession with its unbelievable heroes, leading to an emotionally stunted, socially crippled adulthood, unable to deal with the real world. The other, of course, involves orcs. Story 42. Shatter Me by Tahira Mafi is a series that I believe was written with the intent to cram every trite dystopian teen novel cliché into the narrative in the most clumsy, uncreative, and nonsensical way possible. It's frustrating that there are 13 books in that series. Although it is incredibly popular, I do not understand the appeal. Perhaps it resonates with 13-year-old girls, but actual adults have recommended it to me. A Court of Thorns and Roses is also mediocre for me, despite its popularity. I managed to read 2.5 books in that series. The first book was average but readable. The second book was okay, although my sister had to spoil something to keep me reading because I was about to quit. By the time I reached halfway through the third book, I found that I simply did not care about what happened and set it down. Story 43, The Odyssey. If I had read it on my own, I would have enjoyed it. However, we spent 3 months on this book in English class during high school. It is not a long book. We just analyzed and reanalyzed every single line and every word choice, which were the translator's words, not the original Greek. I disliked the book by the end of the class and burned my copy in a fit of anger. Story 44. I tried reading Atlas Shrugged in high school. It was too tedious for its length and subject matter. It's essentially self-help. Story 45. The Revenant had significant build-up, but it ultimately fell short in the last few pages. It was one of the only books that made me say, that was disappointing, after finishing it. Story 46. Richard Osman's The Thursday Murder Club is simply middle-class tripe and a story that has been done to death since the beginning of time. I have never understood all the hype surrounding it. It is very boring and predictable. I am glad I read a copy and did not waste my hard-earned money. Story 47. 1984 has poor pacing and a dull story. I understand its significance in political discourse, but it is simply a poorly written book. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.